You were listening to a CBS News special report wrapping up the end of the third hearing of the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th insurrection of the Capitol.
Now, this hearing centered around what the committee calls former President Trump's pressure campaign to convince then Vice President Mike Pence to overturn the results of the 2020 election. We just watched as the committee called on two in-person witnesses who provided legal counsel to Mr. Pence after the 2020 election. One witness, former Judge Michael Ludig, you see him there on the right, gave powerful testimony backing Pence's decision to certify the election results for Democrat Joe Biden.
That declaration of Donald Trump as the next president would have plunged America into what I believe would have been tantamount to a revolution within a constitutional crisis in America.
Joining us now is Cardozo law professor Deborah Pallstein. She is the co-director of the Florsheim Center for Constitutional Democracy. Professor, welcome. Thanks very much for being with us. So there is a sense in this country that what happened on January 6th is very much something that depends on where you sit. It is viewed through a partisan lens, those events of January 6th. What we heard today was both in-person witnesses testify that then Vice President Pence did not have the power to intervene in the election certification. How significant was that testimony?
I think it's significant in multiple ways. It's significant, first, to your question with respect to how much the country has been viewing this through a partisan lens. The witnesses today were lawyers and Judge Ludig at the top of the conservative legal profession. Judge Ludig is an extremely well-known, extremely highly thought of, extremely conservative former federal judge. Mr. Jacob, also conservative lawyer who was counsel to the vice president. These are very close members of the Republican Party and of the former administration's own staff saying this was clearly illegal. And it wasn't just Mr. Jacob there in person, it was multiple lawyers from the White House counsel's office, from the Department of Justice, as we've seen over the past days of testimony, saying there is no way this legal theory had any validity. The second thing I think it's significant for is the criminal exposure of lawyers like Mr. Eastman, who took the position that he did. As we saw today, it is clear that Mr. Eastman knew at the time that what he was arguing was not lawful. And he not only, therefore, now faces ethical liability, right? As a lawyer, he may be disbarred for violating his ethical duties. He also now exposes himself to potential criminal liability because of the indication that he was acting with a corrupt purpose, that he knew what he was doing was wrong.
It was such a sobering hearing, especially when you consider how purposeful, slow, and deliberate Judge Ludig's testimony is. We also heard about John Eastman's theory that the vice president did have the authority to overturn election results. I just want to quickly share with viewers what Greg Jacob, that attorney for former Vice President Pence, said on the legal team's findings on that theory.
We examined every single electoral vote count that had happened in Congress since the beginning of the country. We examined the Electoral Count Act. We examined practice under the Electoral Count Act. And critically, no vice president in 230 years of history had ever claimed to have that kind of authority.
Professor, eschewing politics and the noise and everything else around this topic, how significant is that statement, that testimony for folks who just may not understand the role of a vice president during election certifications? How big of a deal was that moment?
I hope it is now clear what the role of the vice president is in elections, but I hope it is also clear the extent to which this is a completely bipartisan understanding of what the Constitution does and means with respect to the vice president. As both witnesses today and others whose testimony appeared on videotape said and made clear in no uncertain terms repeatedly, everybody thought this theory was off the charts. There is nothing in the history of the United States, in the purpose of the Constitution, in its text that would lead anybody to think in a democracy, one person, especially a vice president who was on the ticket in the election, has the authority to overturn the will of the people. That's contrary, as Judge Luttig said very eloquently, I thought, that's contrary to the idea of democracy. That is our most fundamental truth, that the people choose their leaders. Right. And what Mr. Eastman, what the former president was asking the vice president to do was to override that not only legal, but historically lasting principle of American democracy. That significance, and I think as the chairman concluded, the concern that this threat is very much ongoing, that these people, the former president in particular, remain and continue to hold the view that the will of the people can be overridden if the outcome is not something they like, presents, in Judge Luttig's term, a clear and present threat to our democracy that is ongoing.
Professor, I'm just curious, you were talking a moment ago about the prominent stature of Judge Luttig, particularly in Republican and conservative circles. The legal position that he is taking now was known before today, but this is the first time we have seen him in this kind of setting, giving testimony in person like this. Does that change anything, do you think?
So this is a question, right, more for political analysts and media analysts than for a constitutional analyst. But the hope is that it will change at least two things as a legal matter, right? One is it puts the case very clearly to the current Attorney General, Merrick Garland, who will face an extraordinarily difficult decision about which criminal prosecutions to pursue. Obviously, the Justice Department has already pursued hundreds of prosecutions in connection with the specific events of January 6th, but it is clear that criminal liability potentially goes higher up to and including very senior lawyers like Mr. Eastman, and it potentially including the former president himself. This case makes it clear, and the Attorney General indicated in the last week they are watching these hearings closely, how serious that case is. The other thing I hope it makes clear, the other set of lawmakers I hope it speaks to quite directly, are members of Congress themselves. As the chairman of the committee said at the end, there is pending bipartisan legislation on the Hill that would clarify terms of the Electoral Count Act to try to make the manipulation that was attempted in 2020 more difficult to do going forward. There is additional legislation that could protect the ongoing threats to state and local election officials that continue to this day, to the extent that they refuse to buy into the lie that the former president won the election. And Congress has the power to pass laws that make it less likely that this will occur. The hope is that this committee can speak to the rest of Congress and urge that that get done.
Professor Deborah Pallstein, Professor, thanks so much for your insight and analysis. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Professor.
Thank you.
Joining us now is CBS News Chief Election and Campaign Correspondent Robert Costa. Robert, you've been following today's hearing closely. In fact, Congressman Pete Aguilar mentioned your reporting on January 6th. Let's quickly run a clip of that.
In the book Errol, journalists Bob Woodward and Robert Costa write that the president said, quote, "If these people say you have the power, wouldn't you want to?" The vice president says, quote, "I wouldn't want any one person to have that authority." The president responds, "But wouldn't it almost be cool to have that power?" The vice president is reported to have said, "No, look, I've read this, and I don't see a way to do it. We've exhausted every option. I've done everything I could and then some to find a way around this. It's simply not possible. My interpretation is no.
What did you make of hearing that reporting mentioned in the hearing? And why is that specific exchange relevant to what we're talking about here?
That moment, as documented in our book, Peril, Bob Woodward and I reported on how then President Trump brought then Vice President Pence to the brink on January 5th, 2021. It was a one-on-one meeting in the Oval Office following weeks of a relentless pressure campaign to try to goad Pence along, to bring him into Trump's effort to overturn the 2020 election. Pence resisted in that evening meeting on January 5th. Pence resisted again, as testimony today showed, in a phone call on the morning of January 6, 2021. And what we learned today, as we reported in the book, but today was important because we now heard it under oath from witness after witness, from video testimony and live testimony, that ultimately Trump had the intent to block the certification of Joe Biden's election by using the vice presidency as a weapon to do so.
And Robert, I know you spoke to former Judge Luttig just before he entered the hearing room, and I know you described him as emotional. He is a model to many conservatives, and he used quite forceful and direct language today to convey his feelings about the so-called pressure campaign on Mike Pence. Let's go ahead and listen to some of that.
I would have laid my body across the road before I would have let the vice president overturn the 2020 election on the basis of that historical precedent.
Robert, we know that views on January 6th are very much divided along party lines. Does his testimony today change any of that, you think?
Retired federal judge Michael Luttig is a conservative's conservative, going back to his work in Republican administrations, his time on the bench. He was long floated as someone who could possibly be a Republican pick for the Supreme Court. Ultimately, Luttig's message today was to the nation, but it really was also specifically to fellow conservatives, Republicans, and asking them, do they recognize, can they acknowledge how close this nation came to what he called a revolution, potentially, on January 6, 2021, if Pence had somehow upended the certification process. And he also closed his remarks on Thursday afternoon by saying that what's happening now in the Republican Party, a continued belief in Trump's lie about the election that has remained so pervasive in the GOP, that, he said, is, quote, a clear and present danger in the United States. And it looms over the United States in the 2022 midterm elections, as well as ahead of the 2024 presidential election.
And we also spoke before the hearing about Ginny Thomas, the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. Will this committee now get their wish and have her testify?
Both Chairman Benny Thompson and Republican Vice Chair Liz Cheney have both said they would like to have to have Ginny Thomas come speak to the committee. It will be intriguing to see if they issue a formal subpoena for Ginny Thomas in the coming days, or if she is voluntarily deciding to appear before the committee. It's evident that Ginny Thomas is willing in some way to cooperate. She gave a statement to a conservative website, the Daily Caller, and said she's willing to meet with them in some way to clear up what she called misconceptions about her correspondence with then Chief of Staff Mark Meadows at the Trump White House, as well as her emails with John Eastman, the conservative lawyer who was the architect of Trump's plan to overturn the election.
CBS News Chief Election and Campaign Correspondent Robert Costa, thank you for your time.
Thank you.